Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So, taking another fun and exciting episode for you guys today because we're going over another development build of Ymir or Ymir, the brand new Sega Saturn emulator. Maybe people can't agree on what to call it, but we can definitely agree that it's showing a ton of promise and it's running a bunch of new games. So we're going to be going over all of the new games that work and talking about the performance and just why this is exciting for Sega Saturn emulation and Sega fans in general. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, I got a Patreon link down below as well. But honestly, it's only been about 3 months now since this emulator actually showed up as its initial build, and the speed at which it actually develops and ends up innovating and improving on its own emulation is staggering. This is basically just a speed run of Sega Saturn emulation, and we all know from years of research and development that the Sega Saturn hardware is tricky to deal with, and it can be difficult to emulate. For the longest time, we had emulators for basically every single system out there, while Sega Saturn basically did nothing, but now that's completely changed. And taking a tour through the House of the Dead here, definitely not as good as the Sega Model 2 version of the game. Maybe not the best port in existence, but it is still fun, and honestly the performance here just seems to be absolutely what you'd expect. You're going to see some slowdown in the same spots you would on real Sega Saturn hardware, but in some ways I feel like this might be running a frame or two faster, which kind of brings me to my first question of the video. For software emulation, do you want the default to be absolutely one-to-one with the real hardware, or do you want it to potentially run faster where it can? Because obviously in software emulation, that's where you see improvements, maybe in the internal rendering resolution, maybe in the frame rate, maybe being able to clock up the CPU, versus stuff like FPGA recreation. We talk about the Sega Saturn core and that being one-to-one with real hardware. And honestly, the House of the Dead being a Lego Sega Saturn game definitely pushed at everything the Saturn could do with VDP1 and VDP2. While it definitely has a very pixelated look and can look completely chunky compared to Model 2, it is still amazingly fun and it is working great here. And that's definitely something we want to see out of these iterative builds, improvements both in the emulation of existing games as well as new games running, because last time I believe we checked, the House of the Dead was not executing in the Ymir emulator whatsoever. Now it definitely seems to be working. Every once in a while there does seem to be a slowdown that might not be on the original hardware, but again, this is still such a work in progress build. It is just a developer build kind of to try to test out new things, and there is a Discord server as well for these builds and for general information about the emulator, so I will leave a link in the description below as well. One of the moderators in my Discord, the Cool Pup, is over there as well helping people out. And honestly, getting a new Sega Saturn emulator on the market isn't a bad thing. By default, if I'm going to use Sega Saturn emulation, is Med-Defend. While I think that does an outstanding job, I feel like most people in the comments don't care for the GUI, even the aftermarket ones. It just kind of feels a little bit more command line based, and people are pivoting it and bending it to make it work as a point and click interface. But tell me down below, what is your Sega Saturn emulator? Obviously, for the most part, I'm using MiSTer FPGA for Sega Saturn, but I do use emulation. It is still important both to me from a preservation standpoint as well as a capture standpoint, and I get it, not everyone owns a MiSTer FPGA out there. Maybe you don't even own a Sega Saturn either with original discs or an optical disc emulator or a flash card, so I know a lot of people software emulation is the first and last stop to get your Sega Saturn fix in, and getting a new emulator on the market is going to make it that much easier in the future. Now moving over to the next game that is working, this is Manx TT, and I'm showing you the introductory FMV cut sequence to explain that not only are these games getting into the game in engine and showing 3D, but you're also getting FMV support within the emulator as well, because that is a completely different component compared to actually running games, whether they're 2D or 3D. Full motion video and its decoding is a different aspect of emulation, and as far as the playback here on the Manx TT intro scene, I can't see anything that would make me think there's any issues with it whatsoever. And as we get into the actual game as well, it does look very close to what a real Sega Saturn would be doing. Again, this is one of those games definitely better on the arcade version than Saturn that was basically consistent across the board, but otherwise seems to be working pretty well. And big thanks to the Cool Pup, the moderator of my Discord. He helped with these captures, and apparently he got the break button confused with the guest button on the controller. But on the sound side of things, Manx TT sounds exactly like I'd expect it to sound, so it's going to be the first soundtrack sample. We're going to do 45 seconds, get an earful of what the new Ymir emulator sounds like in action, but come back because I still have 3 more new games that are working to show you as far as Sega Saturn emulation is concerned.
Passing the checkpoint!
I mean, it sounds like Manx TT to me, but leave me a comment down below because I always tell you I have two tin ears. I'm a very visual person who works in a visual medium, so when sound is slightly off, I don't ever really usually pick up on it, but you guys have a lot more ears than I do. I just have the two, so I definitely depend on you to listen along for the ride. But honestly, everything here in Manx TT seems to be working really well, and it is another game that's going to work this new development build of Ymir, and that is a fun time. And if you're wondering why I keep saying Ymir or Ymir, I'm just covering all my bases because everyone always loves to go down in the comments and say you're mispronouncing it. I've chosen to pronounce it both ways so I can only be right. But all jokes aside, definitely a game that if you've never played before on Sega Saturn is worth your time and one to check out. But in all these tests we've been basically doing 3D games because they are the more interesting ones to look at. But let's go 2D for a minute. Obviously, Capcom released a ton of fun fighting game ports to the Sega Saturn, and a lot of them would use the RAM cartridge. So depending on which game you're hitting, maybe it's just on disc, or maybe it has that extra RAM card along for the ride. We're taking a look at Darkstalkers right here, a completely 2D game. There are no polygons in this whatsoever, so it is just emulating the actions of VDP1 and VDP2 to lay up sprites and background layers. And it's important to test both 2D and 3D because they're completely different use cases of the same hardware, and we definitely want to see something like Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge run exactly like it would on real hardware. And I definitely checked this out in the background as well, playing around with it, and all of the inputs feel exactly like they would on real Sega Saturn hardware in my opinion, and definitely the same thing on MiSTer FPGA. So that is definitely promising because it doesn't matter, especially in a fighting game, how pretty something looks and how well it plays. If there's any latency that's going to affect the input window of the moves, it isn't going to be a playable experience because you're not going to be able to actually control the game the way you'd want to. And I would say that definitely seems to be adhering here. But leave me a comment down below and you tell me what you think of the footage. I'd say graphically everything is exactly where it needs to be. The heads up display with the life bars, the background layer, the sprites for Morgan and J Talban there are all running exactly like I would expect them to, and that definitely shows a lot of promise. I feel like every once in a while maybe it's dropping a single frame in some of the moves, but it could just be that I haven't checked the Saturn version of this game out in a while, because honestly, if I'm going to play Darkstalkers Revenge, I'm probably going to play the Capcom CPS2 version of it, just the one that is my preferred. But this game is absolutely stunning as far as 2D visuals are concerned, and it's looked great here coming out of Ymir. But go ahead and listen to the soundtrack, your second soundtrack sample of the video, because it has absolutely classic music and maybe way more detectable if there's any issues whatsoever compared to Manx TT, which you might not be familiar with. There's 35 seconds, but come back because I still have 2 more games to show that work. I mean, that sounds exactly like the game should, compared to something like Manx TT, where it can be a little bit hard to tell just based upon the fact that something like the engine noises drowned out the actual soundtrack. But moving over to Cotton Boomerang, an absolutely awesome game. This is another one that is now working on the core, and again, another game that is utilizing basically the entirety of the 2D properties of the Sega Saturn hardware and not really touching polygons whatsoever. And interestingly enough, another arcade port. For basically the entirety of this video, you're just playing games that came out in arcades as well, which was definitely a good place to be in Sega Saturn land, because it had some absolutely outstanding one-to-one ports from arcade originals, or some games that even were better than their arcade counterparts. And Cotton Boomerang here is another game that's going to work in this most recent build of Ymir, and that is awesome. Now, of course, the Sega Saturn has thousands upon thousands of released games between PAL, North American, and Japanese territories, and these are just obviously the games that people want to test first. But there's hundreds upon hundreds of deep-cut Sega Saturn experiences out there that you've probably never even heard of before. Every once in a while someone mentions a Saturn game that even I've never heard of. So actually getting to 100% compatibility and 100% testing of something like a new Sega Saturn emulator is going to take an absolute massive effort and or an eternity if not that many people help. So if you do want to join the Ymir Discord server, again, the link's down below. The more people that are testing these things and reporting issues, the better that the actual emulation will become, because the developers of these things can't work in a vacuum. They definitely depend on people testing and reporting issues to them so they can take a look at it. We've seen it in Saturn Emulation, we've seen it on the MiSTer FPGA side of things. So if you are going to test something like Ymir, you definitely go over to that Discord server and just join out in the issue reporting area. It's 100% worth your time. Take it from me, it helps absolutely everyone get better at these things. Now moving over to Cotton 2, same franchise, different game. Obviously this is running as well. There's a tiny bit of slowdown there that I don't recall being in the original game. So this is one where it is working, but it feels like maybe it's working slightly slower. But again, I'd have to go back and check real Sega Saturn captures. But we're down to our last soundtrack sample of the video, 35 seconds to get a sense of the soundtrack and sound effects, and I'll be right back with more. Not only does, in my opinion, Cotton 2 have one of the best soundtracks of any shmup on Sega Saturn, it also sounds great here coming out of Ymir Emulation. So that is a really nice thing. You're getting gameplay, you're getting responsive controls, you're getting graphics that seem to be 100% buttoned up, and you're also getting the audio to match most of these experiences. Now just because I'm showing you 5 games that work and work really well doesn't mean there aren't hundreds of games out there that probably don't even actually load up yet in the emulator. That is just how these things work when they are being developed. For every game that works, there's going to be another game that just does nothing. And that's just down to how many diverse calls to the hardware, both on the CPU side of things as well as on VDP1 and VDP2 and all the other associated silicon that makes up a Sega Saturn not being complete yet. Some games are going to use like 40% of all of the functions of Sega Saturn hardware. Other games will get close to using almost 100% of them. So if there's a color function to the hardware not yet included in emulation, it's either going to have big glitches or it's not going to work whatsoever. But these 5 games right here, you can definitely play them, you can have fun with them, and this emulator is showing so much incredible promise, and honestly 2025 really is feeling like the year of Sega Saturn. Leave me a comment down below and you tell me what's the first game you test if you're testing a new emulator, the one you're so familiar with you would know if there was an issue or not. For me, it's Nocturne in the Moonlight. But we're done. Join the Discord with the link down below, and I'll see you guys next time for more Saturn fun. Bye bye.